we examine how the gospel spreads in persecuted lands, we're confronted with a model of church planting that's very different from the polished, program-driven methods of the West. In places like Iran and China, the church is multiplying not because of seminaries and budgets, but because of ordinary believers, often young and inexperienced and unqualified in the world's eyes, but they take on leadership in homes. In Iran, believers gather in apartments with no more than a handful of disciples, and leadership falls not to the seasoned pastors with degrees, but to the first person who has the courage to open a Bible and invite others. Many of these leaders are youth and new converts who simply say yes to Jesus. In some cases, an Iranian can be baptized today and within a few weeks start hosting a church fellowship and become the pastor of the small group. The speed is not reckless, it's of necessity born out of persecution. And China shows the exact same story. After the Communist Revolution in 1949, foreign missionaries were expelled, seminaries were closed, and public churches were forced under government control. And many thought Christianity in China was going to die, but the opposite happened. Ordinary farmers and teenagers and laborers opened their homes, shared the gospel, and led secret gatherings. And some were teaching scripture only within weeks after conversion, simply because no one else was able to lead. These barefoot pastors without formal training became the pastors of the underground house church movement, and today estimates place the Chinese house church at tens of millions of converts, making it one of the largest persecuted movements in history, all led primarily by untrained, unqualified men and women of courage. Now, there's a common theme here. Persecution strips the church of luxury, forcing it back to the Acts model, which is what CFM follows. Leaders are quickly raised because time is short, gatherings are fragile, and every believer must be equipped to stand. This is the model I followed. And I would go into a city, baptize new believers, form groups and establish groups in homes, and I would disciple them from a distance, just like the underground churches depend on satellite TV. Some of these groups remain strong today, and some faded away. But the same could be said of Paul's churches. Some thrived, like Philippi and Thessalonica, while others struggled, Corinth and Galatia. Yet critics looked at my model and said it was too fast, too shallow, or unqualified. They mocked the fact that discipleship often happened online rather than face-to-face. And the irony is that while they criticized, I was producing fruit, but they produced none. They demanded perfection, but labored for nothing. The reality is that the persecuted model is the early church model. Paul did not spend decades in each city building institutions. Acts 14 says they ordained them elders in every church. They prayed with fasting, then commended them unto the Lord. And that means that just in months, Paul entrusted new believers with leadership and moved on. Titus chapter 1 gives us another glimpse of what happened. It says, "For this cause I left you in Crete, that you should set in order the things that are lacking and ordain elders in every city, as I appointed you." Titus chapter 1. Now, if Titus had to set in order the things that were lacking, then for a season, many of these churches operated with no elders at all. The churches still gathered, worshiped, and multiplied under the Spirit's guidance even before recognized elders were appointed. Paul's churches, like Thessalonica, Paul was only there for a few weeks, Acts chapter 17 and 2. He left behind a small church that had no elders, but they immediately became examples to all of them that believe in Macedonia and Achaia, 1 Thessalonians 1 and 7. Corinth, Paul stayed 18 months, but even after he left, the church was disorderly, full of divisions, immorality, and chaos, yet Paul still called them the church of God, 1 Corinthians 1 and 2. Crete, Paul left Titus specifically to appoint elders. Churches had already been planted and were functioning before former leaders were installed. Galatia, Paul quickly moved on after planting churches and only later returned to strengthen them and appoint elders, Acts chapter 14. The pattern's clear. Churches in the New Testament often existed for months, even years before there were elders. These churches were not invalid. They were living churches sustained by the Spirit and the Word. This persecution model is not only biblical, it's been confirmed by missionaries across history who saw movements multiply when leaders were released quickly. George Patterson, missionary in Central America, said, "Obedience is better than knowledge. It's better to have 10 churches with lay leaders obeying Jesus than one church with a seminary-trained pastor doing everything." Ying Kai, missionary trainer behind the T4T, Training for Trainers movement in Asia, said, "Don't hold back new believers from leading. If they can share their testimony, they can plant a church." In China, Kai saw men and women become pastors within weeks of baptism because the Spirit made them bold witnesses. Victor John, leader of Bhojpuri movement in India, said, "The person who opens his house and brings his friends is the pastor of the church." Watchman Nee said, and he's the leader of the Chinese house church movement, said, "The church is a home, not an organization. Any brother or sister who is faithful can shepherd others." China provides perhaps the clearest example of fruit. With no seminaries, no denominations, just heavy persecution, an underground church has grown into one of the greatest missionary sending forces in the world. In many cases, believers became pastors almost immediately, gathering their households, leading worship, discipling others while still learning the basics. The Back to Jerusalem movement, birthed in China, the Chinese house church movement, envisioned sending thousands of missionaries westward to the hardest places of earth. None of them came through polished programs. It came through ordinary believers who obeyed the Spirit. The persecution model may look too fast to Western critics, but it's how the gospel thrives under fire. Critics who demand polish forget the church was never meant to be saved or perfect. It was meant to be living, multiplying, and spirit-driven. The persecuted church proves that simplicity and obedience outweigh bureaucracy and perfectionism. My model is not a failed experiment. It's the consistent persecuted church model that happened in the early church, where missionaries saw explosive growth. The way we do it at CFM is we have the same model as the persecuted church. We go, we plant churches, we baptize, but we bring the most strongest leaders of any particular area together, and we form what we call a backbone team. And this is a team that helps facilitate. They're not pastors, they're not elders, they're just lay leaders who facilitate the growth. And as they grow, and as time passes, they become qualified to become ordained elders, and we eventually ordain them as they go through our discipleship process, which most of it is online. And so very similar to the persecution model, we raise up leaders, we get them on the streets very fast, and that's why we see the growth. Churches will survive and some churches won't. But the gospel goes forward and disciples are made, and I testify that it works. People get saved. It is not perfect. Sometimes pride gets in the way. Sometimes some of the leaders, divide people. But it still works, and the gospel still spreads, and that's what's most important. Whether Christ is preached for good reasons or bad reasons, he's being preached. God bless you.